Hi everyone, it's Pleasance from Little Ohm, and today I have a very special interview with my grandmother, Elaine Tidal Lowengard. We're here at her house, and my grandmother just turned 88 recently, right?
Right, April 5th.
And
Too late for presidents.
she, over this past summer, I was living here with the kiddos, and there was a lot going on in the country, especially around race relations over this past summer. And I remember coming down one morning and saying to her, this feels like a really hard time. Obviously the Trump election stuff was starting to happen. And I remember that she was very thoughtful and considerate and gave a little bit more of a global and historical perspective in terms of dealing with difficult political times and how we get through it. And so I thought it would be really fun to ask her again now for you all who are dealing with so much stress and anxiety around the current conditions of our world, maybe some of her insight and perspective. So Grandma, tell me a little bit about, I know that I've heard you talk before about the Depression and when you were born. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like for your family and how that impacted your childhood?
I was born in the middle of the beginning of the worst depression that I think the United States has had. That is, I was born in April of 1929, and I understand that it was just one terrible thing after another in 1929. I certainly wasn't old enough to know. But that among other things, in October, I know this, of course, only as a historical event, that in October of 1929, the stock market failed. And that is a big, when people hear the history of the Depression, there are a lot of things that led to the Depression. And let me clarify, 1929, if you take that as the year when the Depression really began, because up through, it followed close to a decade of huge prosperity and wild spending and great feelings, I guess, of security that somehow the United States had figured out how to be successful. So the Depression was particularly awful because people had such high, and it turns out false, expectations of great global prosperity for everybody. Now, that's not to say that in the 1920s there weren't people who were impoverished or had problems, but the general feeling in the country was happy days are here again, and that everything was going to be wonderful for most people for most of the time. And then the various events that I only know, as I say, from a historical point of view, that led to the unraveling of that great feeling of abundance, and then the failure of the stock market in October, and then followed by even more seemingly unremitting unfortunate events, plus the beginnings of course, Europe was suffering this even more than the United States. And you had the rise of the dictatorships as a response that Europe had to their misfortune. So you had Mussolini in Italy, and you had Hitler in Germany. And however dismal, now if we jump to today, however miserable some of the people are on the world scene today, it would be hard to have anything that was more serious than either Hitler or Mussolini, because they were both horrible fascists.
Did you know that at the time? Like, were you aware of what was happening globally, and what was sort of the
Well,
local reaction here in Hartford and.
Well, I couldn't tell you much about anything before 1936 or 37, and that was really the height of the Depression. You knew it was hard times. If you say those words to me, the first thing I remember is that people would come begging at the back door. I haven't seen that for years and years.
Yeah.
But people came around to the back door here. We were living in the house that I live in now, where you and I are sitting. And at that time, it was the Depression, so we were living with my grandparents, and this was their house. So we lived, because we lived with my grandparents, we lived in a very comfortable way. So we had servants, and we had a lot of servants because employment was so hard to come by. And people would come begging for a meal or any kind of
Did
food.
they give them food at the back door?
Gave them food, and the cook or the second maid or somebody in the kitchen would fix plates of food, and people would sit on the back porch. And I don't think we had a bench there then. I don't remember where we had. We had a laundry. Structure, so you could step up and hang out laundry high up from the ground. And I would imagine if they sat somewhere with their food and it was not raining, that's where they would have sat. But I do remember there being handed out. And it wasn't just occasionally or rarely. It was on a fairly regular basis. There were people eating plates of food in our backyard who we didn't know.
What were the conversations? Like, do you remember hearing conversations or participating in conversations around like the fears or anxieties that people had or the unknown or, right now there's so much conversation, there's so much fear and worry and speculation about what could happen, and every single move is about what might happen next. So I'm just curious about, and even maybe a different time, like maybe it's maybe not Depression time, but maybe another time when things have been challenging.
Well, World War II now doesn't seem scary. I mean, you hear about World War II, and we won. So the worst that could have happened didn't happen. So in a way, that has blotted out a lot of the fears that people felt. But once we got into, I do remember sometimes in 1939, when Europe went to war, and we didn't get into World War. And I definitely remember getting into World War II because by the time 1941 rolled around, I was 12. So I was much more aware of the world situation. But we had this awful depression. In Hartford, we had some really bad weather events, and they will prey on your anxiety too.
Like what?
We had a hurricane and we had a flood in 1936 of the Connecticut River. It's before the retaining walls and everything had been built. And my grandfather had an office on State Street, and they were totally flooded out by the flood of the Connecticut River. And you know how. I'm just trying to think where the State Street's gone, where his office was. Yeah. But it's near where the railroad station is now.
Okay.
And that's quite high. There's quite a hill there. And it was flooded up on the hill. I wasn't allowed to go downtown because people were afraid of disease, and I never have quite figured out what the diseases are that you get from floods. But I think they're real. I think people have lost the sanitary systems in their houses.
How long did that, it seems like that was quite a period of time that was a concern.
Oh, yeah, it was. Yeah. 1936, there were great floods. And then in 1938, we had a hurricane, the likes of which I'm not sure We had some in the 1950s,
Mm-hmm.
but we haven't for a long time
Mm-hmm.
had a big hurricane here.
Like
but
that.
in 1938, we did have a hurricane. I know we lost power.
Mm-hmm.
We always were able to come here to 727 Prospect
Mm-hmm.
Avenue because the person who developed Prospect Avenue
Mm-hmm.
put the telephone poles and a
Mhm.
lot of the other wires underground in
Mhm,
order to have
mhm.
more attractive real
Homes.
estate.
Yeah.
And that served so that you, sometimes to save power to Prospect Avenue.
Yeah.
So I do remember walking. My parents had moved out of the 727
Mm-hmm.
several years before, but I remember going back to
Mhm.
stay here
Mm-hmm.
because my grandparents had power and we did not. So a lot of those things in my mind, because I was so young, are kind of melded and merged.
Right.
And I have to scratch my head to think what happened in 36 because of the flood, what happened in 38 because of the hurricane,
Right.
and then what happened because, and then the general anxiety about the war in Europe, which came out. I was 10 in 1939
Mm-hmm.
when the war broke out, and we were very worried and very concerned. And of course, we didn't have TV,
Mm-hmm.
but we did have radios,
Mm-hmm.
and they were for the whole family.
Mm-hmm.
So we weren't sheltered from anything because it was the family's radio.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew about scary things
Mm-hmm.
like Hitler invading Poland
Mm-hmm.
and Hitler invading Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those things were very worrisome. And we began to have refugees,
Mm-hmm.
Jewish refugees,
Mm-hmm.
that were, I don't know if they were adopted by our congregation,
Mm-hmm.
by the temple. I don't know. But we had special relationships with some of these families that came from Germany.
Yeah.
Because Hitler was very anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Mussolini was only slightly less anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of Jewish refugees, and our family, being active in the temple, were asked to participate.
Yeah.
So we knew there was this, it wasn't our war in 1939, but we were seeing the effects of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so fast forward a little to maybe another time politically when things felt unstable and scary or confusing or whatever your own words are. I don't want to put anything in.
Well, you had a huge right-wing group who didn't want us to have anything. They were America Firsters, believe it or not, and they didn't want us involved in anything that had to do with what was going on in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, they weren't for or against anything. They just wanted to be out of it.
Mm-hmm.
They were out of involvement.
And this is World War II, or
this is World
later?
War II.
Okay.
World
Okay.
War II. And I know that they were very troublesome because they were very xenophobic.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't like anybody but what they thought were real Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, they painted pictures of, terrible things that were going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we went to the movies, to the Colonial Theater, which is still there. It's empty down on Farmington Avenue, but we could walk to the Colonial Theater from our house.
Mm-hmm.
And we went when I was a little kid. It felt like we went every Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was every Saturday afternoon, but we went to a good many movies.
Mm-hmm.
And there were always short films.
Mm-hmm.
And the short films were news films. So you learned what was going on in the world, whether you wanted to or not.
Uh-huh.
And then there were the regular movies were full of propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
By the time we entered the war, and we were drawn to be anti-German after 1939, and then after we entered the war in 1941, we became very anti-Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
And we were taught to hate
Mm-hmm.
the Germans and the Japanese,
Mm-hmm.
which we had to unlearn after the war when they
Mm-hmm.
became our allies. And
Mm-hmm.
thank heavens we don't see them as enemies today.
Mm-hmm.
That's long gone.
Did you feel like when that was happening and you were taught to like hate a certain group, and then did you feel that? Like, did you? I mean, as someone who's been,
oh, you did.
Why do you think? Because of the propaganda?
Oh,
Because
sure.
you felt so American? Like, what was?
I think it was the propaganda about how dangerous and cruel the Japanese and Germans were. They were the two primary targets. And I think you just learned it because people were afraid. I mean, you have to realize for World War II, they didn't know what we know now, which is that the United States and the Allies won. It was genuine that we might not survive. And we had air raid drills and there was the possibility that there would be bombing attacks on us. And of course, there was almost nothing of World War II that took place on the continental United States.
Right.
Yeah, I can't think of anything really.
Right. No.
Maybe an occasional, what do they call those German warships would allegedly be sighted somewhere, but that was usually a good distance from our shores. But and it was wartime. Then there was rationing.
Yeah.
And we had ration coupons.
Yeah.
And there was a shortage of stuff that was needed for the Army and the Navy. It was very hard to find any clothes that were either beige, the color of the Army uniforms, or navy blue, because those dyes were being used for the war effort.
Yeah.
And you couldn't get leather. And I can't remember. And of course, because of the involvement, it was very hard to get rubber because the rubber came from Malaysia and places that were under fire. So they weren't very, painful sacrifices, but they were different.
Things that you noticed.
Yeah.
Okay, so then moving on to the 60s, Vietnam, that era. Anything that you remember specifically?
I'm just trying to think. There was always a lot. Anytime the United States was challenged, our feelings get hurt first. Then we feel insulted, and then we get angry. And so it's been a roller coaster over the years.
Yeah.
And but I don't think it's anything new for us to feel that everybody doesn't love us.
So how do you feel now? Like reading all the stuff that's happening. I mean, you're still, watching the news every day and reading the papers. What do you think about the current climate, and do you have any sage advice for us?
Well, you do have to become if you're only going to be current, you're going to be subject to a lot of ups and downs. I think as you get older, and I think this may be a product of my age rather than the age in which I've lived, I think as you get older, you realize that we're all subject to propaganda. And whether it's knowingly delivered to us or innocently delivered to us. And I just think you have to wait and see a lot of times. You don't want to be totally without any action, but you don't want to over-respond. It's just getting the good old balance, I guess, moderation. But the Vietnam War I felt was a disgrace for us. We never should have been involved. And that was false fears. There was something that they called the domino effect. And in theory, for the people that were falsely fearful, they absolutely believed the domino effect. And it wasn't Vietnam, but if we didn't win the war in Vietnam, then the next thing would be China was the enemy at that time. China was going to come and overtake us. And now, as we look back on it, they didn't have the technology and the strength that were attributed to them. You have to be careful that it's not that you aren't subject to propaganda. I think that's it.
And at the same
so, what are
time,
your friends worried about?
I think at the same time, like, sorry, I'm going to show you guys Josie, who came and joined us too. You're such a big community person. Like, do you think was it intentional to be heavily involved in your local community, in what you could do and take action in between the temple and the organizations and the boards that you were on as a way to respond to global concerns that you couldn't help with? Like have always been so active in the community and just very intellectually, like, awake to what's going on in the world, but didn't over-respond to that. However, you were very active in the community. What I'm saying is that I feel like right now with social media and with the news, there's a lot of people who are constantly on that, and then they're just complaining and having a lot of anxiety, but not doing anything because they feel like they can't change anything globally, so they're not doing anything. So I'm just curious about, did you ever think about the relationship between your activity locally, and how that contributed to your belief system or your values?
Well, the government promoted local actions and it helped you do them. I mean, like the air raid drills, when I think about it. My father, my mother, and her packaging, we were supposed to have, the thing that comes to mind right now is that somebody gave my father a case of canned pineapple. This is how hilariously funny some of this is in retrospect. But because pineapples, I guess we didn't have a lot of trade in the Caribbean or something, because pineapple seemed to have come to Hartford from the Pacific. And we had a case, I think I may have told you this story before, I don't know whether it was 12 or 24 or 48, whatever size it was. We had a case of canned pineapple that somebody had given my father. And it went into a very safe place in the cellar to be kept and taken out for special occasions, because we were supposed to be deprived of pineapple. And of course, at the end of World War II in 1945, by the time the war was over, there was half of the case of pineapple was still down there to be used for dire circumstances. But there were all these funny, unimportant, basically, shortages of things.
Yeah, right.
Like shoe leather.
Right.
There was rationing of leather shoes. They hadn't invented canvas shoes, really.
Right.
They were sort of an unsatisfactory replacement for your leather shoes.
Right.
But that was promoted. We had these, we had air raid drills, and I don't know how often they were, but I certainly remember them. You had to turn all your lights out, and they came by and complained, and you had air raid wardens for the block to make sure everything was blotted out so that those enemy bombers couldn't come over you.
Yeah.
And you would have those every so often.
Yeah.
And that was brought close. And there were shortages of things in a way that there hadn't been, because we didn't have it. We had to build an army felt we had to build an army very quickly.
Right.
So the army had to be given priorities, I said. And you couldn't have beige and navy blue because they'd been swept up for the armed forces. And I know, as I think about it, there were kind of air raid places set up in various communities. And because we were on the East Coast, we had one down the hill from Hamilton Heights, where Mount St. Joseph's was located. And there was an air raid warden station, I don't know what you'd call it, there. And we were told we shouldn't talk to these strange soldiers because We used to walk by there on our way.
Did you
to and from
feel
school.
like afraid about having it? Were you nervous? Like, were there any feelings that you remember about this? You're so, factual, like remembering the moments, but not the feelings. Do you remember it causing, or was it just?
Well, you were
the
afraid
way of,
by the time the war was underway.
yeah.
There were reports about horrible situations in the enemy prisoner of war camps.
Yeah.
And that Americans who were taken prisoner by the Japanese
and that would
Germans.
come to you on the radio and in the newspapers.
Yeah, radio, the newspapers, and movies.
And
well,
movies,
we did have movies.
Right. You said
but
that.
It's hard to think back to this time because we didn't have television.
Right.
And television has made such a difference in our lives,
in getting news
quality
and,
of information, I think. Yeah.
Okay, that's all my questions. Do you have anything else you want to share?
No, but I think, one thing I would say. You have to do your own figuring out and thinking about this and trying to decide what's a real fear, what's somebody trying to make you, what's propaganda to make you feel emotionally one way or another. And you have to find out what's true and what the situation really is. So maybe I'm better at handling some of the scares. What are the scares that your friends have?
I think that in general, especially with a lot of our people being in D.C., working for the government, is a lot of the work that they've been doing is being dismantled. A lot of things are being not going to be funded that a lot of us care about. On the social service side, that feels really scary. From the national parks to public radio to the libraries to Planned Parenthood. And it just I can speak for myself, I feel like there's a lot of things that are happening that are not aligned with my core values of what I believe all humans should have and how arts and culture really play into the wholeness of our life. And so it feels sad and it feels scary. And I know a lot of our little OM students have a lot of anxiety, and just social media really plays into that, just like you were saying with the propaganda. I also think we have it on the far left and the progressive side these days in creating a lot of fear and scarcity. And it's hard to tell what's real and what's not, and be able to help out with what you really can, too.
Well, I think you have to look at your own values and look at the values and look at what's true. Right. Because there are a lot of false news out there. Right. And a lot of things too. And people saying, and I mean, I think I happen not to be a fan of Mr. Trump. Right. But for him he is promoting the two feelings. One is that somehow there was this miraculously wonderful, perfect United States that there used to be, and that's gone. Let's make America great again. Yes. Well, America was never that great, but it's also not that terrible now. Right. I consider that kind of scary propaganda. Right. I don't know what they're trying to do, but attract help for themselves. I don't quite get it, because if you look back, there never was a place, even in the way back to the 20s, if you go back to that, everybody wasn't doing well in the 20s. There were, and if you try to dig to get the facts and find out what the truth is there, because there's an awful lot of baloney out there. Yeah. That's all I would say. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks, Grandma. Well, thank you for listening. Yay, thanks, I always have plenty of opinions. She does. Hopefully we'll have part 2 this summer. So you can send us your questions. And we'll do another interview this summer when we come back. All right, bye. Thanks. Bye.